For 45 years, they said they would never give it up. Not under sanctions, not under military attacks, not under the most suffocating diplomatic pressure any nation has ever endured in the modern era. Enriched uranium was not merely a weapons program for the Islamic Republic. It was the regime's raison d'etre. It was its claim to regional supremacy, the card that made every enemy think twice, every negotiation tilt in Tehran's favor, every threat from Washington and Tel Aviv land with less weight than it otherwise would. And then, in a matter of days, they surrendered. Iran agreed not to possess nuclear weapons. Iran agreed to hand over its stockpiles of enriched uranium. And it agreed in no uncertain terms. Read that again. It is not a ceasefire. It is not a pause. It is not a temporary suspension that Tehran could quietly reverse in 6 months. It is the surrender of the most significant strategic asset the Islamic Republic has ever possessed. The red line that the IRGC has claimed for decades it would die before crossing. Crossed. And the way it happened, without a single American soldier setting foot on Iranian soil, without an airstrike on underground strongholds, without the most complex military raid since D-Day, is the part of this story that even Washington didn't fully anticipate. Stay with me. What just happened in Iran is one of the most consequential events in the history of the Middle East, and the full weight of it hasn't sunk in yet. To understand why this moment is so historically devastating, you need to understand what that uranium really represented. Not technically, strategically. The 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, had limited Iran's enrichment program to 3.67% purity, with a stockpile cap of 300 kilograms under continuous international inspection. It was a milestone that kept Iran's nuclear capabilities at a distance from weapons-grade material, a threshold that Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States could not accept being breached. Then Trump withdrew from the agreement during his first term. Tehran let go of the brakes, first to 20% enrichment, then to 60%. By June 2025, the stockpile of 60% enriched uranium had exceeded 440 kilograms. That is enough fissile material, properly processed, for more than 10 nuclear warheads. What experts call breakout time, the period between a political decision to build a weapon and the technical capability to detonate it, had collapsed to something close to zero. For Israel, this was not an abstract security concern. It was an existential nightmare with a ticking clock. For Saudi Arabia, which had been watching Iran's accumulation of regional power for decades, a nuclear-capable Tehran represented the end of any strategic balance the Gulf had maintained. For the United States, a nuclear-armed Iran in a region where Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey had each privately signaled that they would pursue their own programs in response, meant the start of the most dangerous proliferation cascade of the nuclear age. These figures do not come from Moscow. They do not come from Tehran. They come from Western archives and sources themselves. And that is exactly why what happened next is so extraordinary. Here is what the mainstream media is not showing with the clarity it should. Iran did not back down because it was bombed. Iran backed down because Trump looked at a 34-kilometer-wide strait in the Persian Gulf and chose the strait. The uranium was distributed across 3 underground fortresses built specifically to survive American and Israeli airstrikes. Natanz, buried deep within the mountains, surrounded by concrete and lead shielding. Isfahan, holding approximately half of the total stockpile in tunnels more than 90 meters deep. Fordo, built entirely inside a mountain, designed to withstand direct attacks from the most powerful conventional munitions in existence. The attacks of June 2025 severely damaged these facilities. A significant portion of the stockpile had been buried under rubble. But here is the problem that the attacks could not solve. Uranium enriched to 60% does not disappear through radioactive decay. It does not degrade. It does not become harmless. It can remain at levels of enrichment relevant for weapons for hundreds of years. The bombs destroyed the infrastructure. They did not destroy the material. The material, given time and resources, can be rebuilt around it. The program could be rebuilt. This is what led the Pentagon to present Trump with a ground operation plan that defense officials described in no uncertain terms as a logistical nightmare more complex than D-Day. The 82nd Airborne Division would parachute into hostile territory and build a landing strip from scratch under fire. Delta Force and Navy SEAL teams would blast through 90 meters of rubble to reach tunnels 90 meters deep. Operators in hazmat suits would enter the underground facilities with radiation sensors, checking each cylinder for traps, advancing step by step through environments where a single mistake meant contamination. All of this under continuous attacks from Iranian missiles and drones for weeks. Only a few dozen soldiers in the entire U.S. Army have received training in nuclear material recovery operations. The plan was feasible on paper, just as almost anything is feasible on paper. In practice, former defense officials said it was something they could not recommend carrying out. Trump looked at that plan. And then he looked at the 34-kilometer-wide strait. And he chose the strait. On April 13th, the U.S. Navy declared a total blockade of Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz. Ships from the Ghost Fleet, vessels that had been moving Iranian oil through alternative channels for years, were all sent back. Before the blockade, 97% of Iran's oil went to China. U.S. destroyers redirected tankers linked to China regardless. The rich starry appeared to pass through, was tracked, and was sent back to the Persian Gulf. The surveillance architecture was total, the enforcement complete. But the blockade didn't stop just oil. Most of Iran's food imports arrived by sea. Wheat, rice, cooking oil, pharmaceuticals, spare parts for industrial equipment. Everything passed through Hormuz. The blockade simultaneously sealed both ends of Iran's economic circulatory system. Nothing went out, nothing came in. And in Tehran's highest decision-making chambers, those who understood the numbers made the calculation that the blockade forced them to make. In 10 days, the oil wells would begin to be shut down due to excess inventory. Once shut down, some would never fully recover. In 10 days, food reserves in major cities would begin to shrink visibly. In 10 days, industrial facilities dependent on imported raw materials would begin to shut down. In 10 days, the flow of money sustaining every function of the Iranian state, from soldiers' salaries to the financing of proxy networks, to the subsidies that maintain the last threads of the social contract with the Iranian people, would effectively be zero. 60% enriched uranium is a bargaining chip, a powerful one. Decades of investment in leverage, in deterrence, and in the psychology of regional dominance. But what does a regime do with enriched uranium when its economy has collapsed? What does a government do with a nuclear program when its people cannot find fuel? What does the IRGC protect with its sacred stockpile when the regime itself is 2 weeks away from structural bankruptcy? Hormuz answered the question that no amount of sanctions had forced Iran to confront at this speed, with this finality. Uranium is a bargaining chip. Hormuz is a matter of the regime's survival. And when these two things come into direct conflict, only one of them determines whether the regime will exist next month. For those familiar with history, this comes as no surprise. The mechanism we are seeing now has appeared before, under different names, in different geographies, but with the same devastating logic. Vietnam taught us that brute military force does not guarantee political victory. The United States dropped more tons of bombs on Vietnam than in all of World War II combined, and yet lost the war in the realm of will and resistance. Iraq taught us that occupation creates more instability than it resolves, that overthrowing a regime without understanding what comes next is a recipe for decades of chaos. Afghanistan taught us that regimes can survive direct attacks for decades when they have an ideological foundation and external funding to sustain them. The Strait of Hormuz taught us something different. It taught that when you completely seal off the economic lifeline of a regime that is already cracking from within, that is already facing military defections, that already has a people boiling over in the streets, that already has a fractured leadership fighting for control of what remains, when you do all of this simultaneously, the math of survival trumps 45 years of ideological commitment. Not in months, in days. And this mechanism, total economic pressure applied to an internally fractured regime, is not specific to Iran. It is the standard. It is what happens when a state that depends on a single revenue stream to finance its internal cohesion suddenly and completely loses that stream. The speed of the collapse always surprises, because regimes seem solid until the moment they cease to be. And the moment they cease to be arrives suddenly, without warning, with a speed that no outside analyst can accurately predict. What we are seeing in Iran today is not a historical anomaly. It is a pattern that has been repeated. What is different this time is the speed, and it is this speed that connects the past to the present in a way that has not yet been fully understood. But here is the layer that no one is discussing, the part that will determine whether what Trump announced actually happens. And it is this layer that will directly affect you, not abstractly, not geopolitically, but in the price you pay every week. Iran is not a homogeneous structure governed from a single center. It never has been, and now it is more fractured than at any point in its post-revolutionary history. On one side, President Masoud Pezeshkian. He wanted a ceasefire before the war reached its current intensity. He was publicly warning, in language extraordinary for a sitting Iranian president, that the economy would completely collapse in 3 weeks. His position on uranium is pragmatic in the coldest possible sense. Give it up, lift the blockade, keep the regime standing. Institutional humiliation, yes. A retreat from 45 years of declared principle, yes. But a humiliated regime still exists. A regime economically annihilated within the next 14 days does not. On the other side, IRGC commander Ahmad Vahidi. And according to sources at Iran International, what Vahidi has been doing as negotiations continue is not passive objection. It is the active assumption of state functions, blocking presidential appointments, filling positions in the intelligence ministry on his own, outside the constitutional process that requires presidential authority, pushing for the replacement of the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council with someone aligned with the IRGC's interests, effectively assuming executive powers that constitutionally belong to the civilian government. Pezeshkian formally demanded that these powers be returned. Vahidi categorically refused. This is not a policy disagreement between two branches of the same government. It is a constitutional coup being carried out in slow motion within a regime that is simultaneously trying to negotiate with Washington, manage a popular uprising in dozens of cities, maintain military operations with soldiers deserting in droves, and avert the economic collapse that is just 2 weeks away. And above them both, providing neither clarity nor resolution, the supreme leader in a coma. Mojtaba Khamenei, declared supreme leader after his father's death, almost never seen in public, is constitutionally the commander-in-chief of all Iranian armed forces. In practice, Vahidi is exercising command. The vacuum of legitimacy created by a supreme leader who cannot function is the single most important enabler of the IRGC's seizure of power. Every decision requires authorization that cannot be obtained, which means that the entity willing to act without authorization wins the institutional dispute. The IRGC is willing to act without authorization. That is exactly the point of what Vahidi has been doing. Now place the decision to deliver the uranium within this framework and ask the question that every intelligence service monitoring Tehran is asking. Can the IRGC sabotage this? The answer, technically, is yes. It could obstruct the physical delivery process, block access to the facilities where the stocks are stored, delay inspections, or create bureaucratic friction that extends the timeline indefinitely while the regime claims compliance in good faith. It could move stocks to different locations, underground facilities that Iran has never officially acknowledged. The IAEA has consistently documented that Iran's declared nuclear activities do not account for all of Iran's nuclear activities. Material moved previously cannot be verified as missing until inspectors have unrestricted access to the facilities controlled by the IRGC. It could declare a portion of the stockpile as delivered, while retaining a hidden reserve that preserves the technical option it is publicly abandoning. These options exist on paper. Whether they can be executed in practice depends on a single question. Does the IRGC believe it can survive whatever happens if Trump concludes that Iran is not complying? This is a specific and dangerous thing to do to a specific and dangerous man who has 3 aircraft carrier strike groups deployed and a ground operation plan already drawn up and sitting on a shelf. The IRGC faces 3 options. None are good. Accepting the handover of the uranium is institutional suicide for the organization that has built its entire identity around protecting that stockpile. The narrative of resistance collapses. The legitimacy of the IRGC's existence is fundamentally called into question. But the regime survives. And a surviving regime is a platform from which the IRGC can eventually rebuild itself. Sabotaging the decision and continuing the war invites Trump to play all his cards simultaneously. The blockade intensifies. The ceasefire ends. The ground operation plan that defense officials called a logistical nightmare ceases to be a plan on the shelf and begins to be an order in execution. The 82nd Airborne, Delta Force, the SEAL teams. The entire architecture of the most complex military operation since D-Day becomes the direct consequence of the IRGC choosing sabotage over surrender. Carrying out the internal coup, overthrowing the Pezeshkian government, declaring martial law, ending the diplomatic process, removes the last faction arguing for the regime's preservation through negotiation and hands over the entire Iranian state to the organization whose strategy produced the current catastrophe. It would be, as one analyst described it, driving the final nail into a regime that is already collapsing. And while this calculation is being made in Tehran, the Iranian people are standing in fuel lines in an oil-producing country. Watching the regime that said their sacrifices were necessary for regional dominance hand over the centerpiece of that dominance to the country it has called the Great Satan since 1979. Iranian state television claimed that 87% of the population supported the war, citing a poll from a source that was never named. No one explained why. The Western media barely noticed the contradiction. The 2009 uprising erupted over a stolen election, the 2019 one over a rise in gasoline prices, the 2022 one by the death of a young woman in police custody. Each was triggered by a single visible injustice that crystallized the accumulation of anguish into organized protest. Current conditions are more dire than all three of those moments combined. Economic collapse, military defeat, and diplomatic surrender are happening simultaneously. And this is where it hits you directly. 20% of the world's oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz. When that strait is at stake, the price of fuel at the pump, your electricity bill, the shipping costs behind every product you buy, all of it moves in tandem. The U.S. blockade has stabilized Hormuz for now. But what happens if the IRGC chooses sabotage? What happens if the uranium delivery process collapses? What happens if the Iranian crisis deepens instead of resolving? The answer doesn't lie in Tehran. It hits your pocketbook before the end of the month. Here's where this could go, and none of the paths are reassuring. In the first scenario, the delivery goes ahead as announced. The blockade is lifted. The Pezeshkian regime survives, institutionally humiliated. The IRGC, weakened, begins to quietly rebuild its position. Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iraqi militias, all recalculate their risk exposure without Tehran's nuclear umbrella. The narrative of protection that has sustained the proxy network for decades begins to disintegrate. Those questions, if Iran has surrendered its greatest asset under economic pressure, what is the protection they promised us worth, once asked, cannot be undone. Perception, once destroyed, cannot be restored with a press release. It takes years of demonstrated capability to rebuild. The Middle East enters a new balance that no one yet knows how to navigate. In the second scenario, the IRGC sabotages the process. It blocks physical access. It moves stockpiles to undeclared locations. The IAEA, which has consistently documented that Iran's declared nuclear activities do not account for all of Iran's nuclear activities, cannot verify what is missing. Trump concludes that Iran is not complying. The ground operation plan ceases to be a plan on the shelf. The 82nd Airborne, Delta Force in 90-meter tunnels wearing hazmat suits, Navy SEALs blowing through 90 meters of rubble. The Pentagon executes what its own officers have called a logistical nightmare. The Strait of Hormuz closes. 20% of the world's oil disappears from global markets. What happens to the price per barrel in this scenario is not an economic abstraction. In the third scenario, the most severe, Vahidi executes the full coup. He overthrows Pezeshkian. He declares martial law. He shuts down the diplomatic process. The Iranian state, entirely in the hands of the IRGC, faces Trump with 3 aircraft carrier strike groups in position, a ground operation plan already drawn up, a people whose combustible material is everywhere, and a network of proxies that is recalculating its loyalties in real time. This scenario is not confined to Iran's borders. It radiates outward. And the implications for regional stability, for the price of every commodity passing through the Persian Gulf, are of a magnitude we haven't seen since 1973. For 45 years, they said they would never give in, that it was the red line they would die before crossing. And then they crossed it. But here's the question no one can answer yet. Is the IRGC's silence in the hours since that announcement acceptance? Or is it the calm before the most dangerous decision the organization has ever made? Trump announced it. Iran has not officially confirmed it. Between the announcement and the confirmation lies a gap in which the IRGC's decision on whether to accept institutional humiliation or escalate toward the regime's destruction is still being made. Vahidi is assuming state functions. Pezeshkian is demanding them back. The supreme leader is in a coma. The ceasefire deadline is passed. The blockade remains. Storage tanks are filling up. Oil wells are nearing the shutdown point from which some will not recover. Soldiers are deserting. Proxy networks are asking whether dying for Tehran still makes strategic sense. The Gulf states are building pipelines that will render Hormuz irrelevant before the decade ends. And somewhere in the underground facilities that American strikes buried under rubble, the uranium that the IRGC called a national pride, a shield of resistance, and a reason for its existence is in a condition that no one in Washington can fully verify, and no inspector has yet accessed. The unthinkable has happened in Iran. And the most unthinkable part isn't the surrender itself. It's what happens next within the regime that was forced to make it. That response is still being decided in Tehran, in tunnels, in rooms where men who have been fighting each other since 1988 are choosing between survival and the story they've told themselves their whole lives. We'll be following this every day. What was announced yesterday could be reversed tomorrow, and when it happens, you need to be here. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, this is exactly the kind of moment you need to be here for. The clock has never been closer to midnight.